In fact, one might think that it is about non-citizenship. When we look at the migration, asylum seekers and refugees, obviously one thing that they lack is citizenship, or at least status of citizenship. But of course, from my point of view as a reader, I happen to think that that is directly related to citizenship, because citizenship, as much as about its inside definition, as it is about relates to other identities or other forms of being. And it is in that relationality, or as we will hear about later on, the intersectionality, that interrelationships or the objects that we study begin to show their interesting aspects. And then we have two books that are explicitly about citizenship, Citizens at the Center and Creating Citizen Consumers. And then so the question that I would like to pose to our panelists, what is the conception of citizenship that they hold when they look at, for example, citizens at the center, deliberative participation in healthcare decisions? For some, that may not really have anything to do with citizenship. So there's a different kind of casting that needs to be there. In the case of politics of insecurity, the casting or thinking about it relates to in which ways it is citizenship. But in books such as Citizens at the Center and Creative Consumer Citizens is a question of why use the term citizenship to investigate something that others may not have used, for example, consumership, on the question of consumer. What is the consumer citizens as distinct from consumers, period? And then there's, of course, the two books, one on the European Union and party politics in Central and Eastern Europe. I mentioned this as being less obviously about being citizenship. Of course, I should now call that into question. Why should it be really less obvious that it is about citizenship? Because it is clearly dealing with one of the significant institutions through which citizenship is enacted, parties and party politics. It is one of the most significant mechanisms through which actually citizens not only gain subjectivities to become voters, but also have impact on the political process directly by being involved with parties or even voting for or against them. So in that sense, and then the second part of Central and Eastern Europe, obviously, this is one of the most significant issues of the enlarged Europe, and to what extent and how the differently constituted democracies, or more recent democracies, as it were, are going to be integrated into European conceptions of democracy. Speaking of which, of course, then Mike's book on democracy might also be considered not directly about citizenship, but to what extent really that can be argued. Democracy and citizenship are obviously intimately related. And then, of course, we would want to hear from Mike to what extent democracy and citizenship also live uneasy lives together. And it raises all those issues. And Janet's book with Marion Barnes and Helen Sullivan on power, participation, and political renewal, although it does not explicitly use the term citizenship, it's almost a definition of citizenship. Participation, political renewal, and power are, of course, the very constitutive elements of citizenship. Now, that's how I see it, the various strands, connective tissues, and so on. What I would like to do is perhaps, within the same order that I have introduced my colleagues to you, beginning with Mike, to spend a couple of minutes to address the issues that I lay out and the questions that I may have actually left out. Mike?
Can I crawl under the table at this point? Yes. I've actually got a 4-volume thing on democracy. It's any colour you like, as long as it's black, and it's out on the table. The pink one on the piece of paper was more interesting. I mean, there are a range of tough questions there, but one thing I find I had to try and find 85 classic pieces on democracy from ancient Greece to the present day, looking way back that far into the past and into the future. And it reminded me, a mistake to confess really after having written a couple of books on democracy of my own, it reminded me just how incredibly diverse that topic was. And yet, I generally find that democracy is easier to get a grip on than citizenship. I find it a firmer, more institutionally based, slightly easier to define concept than citizenship itself. Which is why I'm kind of avoiding the question so far, because it's very difficult to get a handle on citizenship. But one handle I do get, and which has a kind of constructivist bent that is that certainly overlaps with SIG's interests, is what's happening with debates around democracy today, and following on from that, what types of citizenship capabilities and capacities and knowledges, different types of democrats, which we all are, of course, now, nobody would say I'm not a democrat, different types of democrat would expect of citizens, and an extraordinary range of attitudes, capacities, knowledges, and so on, which they would expect. I mean, one example would be so-called deliberative democracy. If you do democratic theory, this has been the mantra for the last 10, possibly 15 years. Democracy is no longer about counting heads, it's about voices. It's about deliberation. It's about convincing others of your view. It's about persuasion. It is not about pre-deliberative knowledges. It's not about ignorant voters anymore. This is something that Celia is dealing with. She said she's going to say some rude things about deliberative democracy, so we'll look forward to that in a minute. But she's done a big study of that. But if democracy is now deliberative, if talking counts more than voting, if rational persuasion counts more than counting heads, then that implies a great deal about citizens and their capacities. It implies a lot about education for citizenship. It might tell us something about how well or badly constructed the citizenship curriculum in English secondary schools is with regard to rhetoric, debating capacities, confidence for that, and so on. It implies something about commitment of people to come to forums, to be part of citizen juries, to be part of deliberation days that some people propose before elections. In other words, to have a rather more Republican than liberal outlook on the importance of elections and the importance of political participation. The danger of open-ended questions is one could go on, but you don't want me to go on. You don't want me to go on too long. Just a couple more examples. Cosmopolitan citizenship, quote unquote, has been a big theme in the citizenship literature. It features prominently in Engin's co-edited handbook of Citizenship Studies. For example, a lot of the models of democracy, in some ways associated with David Held of this parish before, are about cosmopolitan democracy, the need to expand practices of democracy, even in a relatively familiar way, above the level of the nation-state to regions, globe, as well as local within nation-states. Do we then, with global warming and all the rest of it, do we then need to begin to demand of citizens or understand citizens as having to have a cosmopolitan outlook? In other words, citizenship is still of a nation state. That's where your formal status and membership comes from. But as a very part of that, and perhaps paradoxically, the outlook of a good citizen today must be well beyond the borders, or to be able to relate what is happening within borders to one's impact and the impact of one's country beyond them. Then again, ecological democrats would say the species barrier, the line between humans and other animals, should not be drawn where it's previously been drawn. The great apes should be citizens like us. We should be able to enlarge our thinking to encompass different sorts of beings, very radically different ways of speaking, living, practicing. And although this seems almost unthinkable now, perhaps it won't be unthinkable in 10, 15, 20 years. I'll stop.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mike. Margie?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the question you were asking us was what kind of conception of citizenship we hold. We're responsible for this book, Citizens at the Centre. And I think perhaps very different from Mike, and where we might end up having some interesting controversy, is we very much wanted to move away from a notion of the citizen as an abstract or ideal category, or something that philosophers, academics, political scientists might legislate on, and try and look at how people actually act as citizens when they're interpellated, hailed, or asked to, take on that identity.